In this last part, I would like to introduce a tool developed by Fink that helps instructors develop the elements of their course and ensure they are in alignment. Now, you may be asked to teach a course that has already been developed with the learning outcomes, the assessments, and the learning content. However, even then, it is important to understand these components of course design so that you can make sure they serve the purpose they are supposed to, and so that you can respond to changing circumstances. The alignment grid contains 4 columns. It mostly represents the 3 elements we have been seeing from the models of course design, but it has this extra resources column at the end. There is some flexibility in how you choose to fill in this grid. My approach is to reserve the teaching and learning activity column for actual activities and practice, and to place in the resources column any sources of information, such as lecture, readings, video lessons, and web pages. Let's take a closer look at each of these columns. This first one is for learning outcomes, your goals for students. And you would just list one outcome per cell, just one per row. And while this is where course design should start, I do think it is perfectly fine, even before articulating your learning outcomes for students, to start by surveying content that is typical of a course you need to teach but are new to teaching. Sometimes you need to get a sense of what the topics and big concepts are and how they get used in the field before you can think about what goals you have for students. The key is to just be sure you do eventually step back from the content and assess what goals you want students to accomplish before you then settle on what content to include in your course. In the end, you want the learning goals to drive the design of the course, not the content. The next column is for how learning will be assessed for each of those outcomes, how you will know that students have reached that outcome. The third column is for the learning activities students will engage in to meet those outcomes, basically the practice or application they will engage in. You may even place lectures in here, so long as they are interactive and engage students in processing the information you are providing them. The important thing is to make sure every learning outcome has some sort of associated practice for students to be able to apply what they are learning and to get feedback, either from the instructor or simply by observing what happens when they apply what they are learning. And then finally, we have a column for the resources students will need to draw from as they engage in the activities: readings, lectures, video lessons, and so on. The idea is that each row of the grid represents one learning outcome and its aligned course elements that help ensure students meet that learning outcome. Let's take a look at what an example row might look like in one of these grids. Let's say that I have the learning goal for you to be able to use a course design alignment grid to align elements of your own course. Next, I need to decide what evidence I will need in order to know you have accomplished this learning goal. I would most likely go with something along the lines of completion of a course design alignment grid with the elements all aligned. That should at least give me a pretty good sense of how well you are able to use this tool. Next, I need to decide what activity you could complete that would help you learn how to use this tool. I like to think of this column as practice, how you can practice this so that you get the hang of using it. How about practice filling in a course design alignment grid, preferably with feedback from the instructor? And finally, we have the resources column. While resources could refer to a variety of things, I generally think of the information students need in order to reach the outcome. This might include a lecture presentation along with demonstration of how the grid is used, and perhaps also a reading by Fink that explains the rationale of the grid. Okay, so there we have one completed row, one learning outcome and its aligned course elements. The next step would be to list a new learning outcome and then its aligned course elements. Now, one thing you might encounter is when the assessment and the learning activity are the same thing. Some activities are both learning opportunities and assessment opportunities. That is okay to have the same activity listed in both these columns. Just keep in mind that grading for an activity like this should probably be based on participation, since learning is still taking place. If you want to have more of a summative assessment in which students demonstrate what they have learned, make sure they have opportunities to practice what they are learning first. Let's take a look at one more sample row. Let's say our learning goal is to explain how physiological mechanisms support sensation and perception. This is a bigger one, and I might assess it with a creative project based on a topic of the student's choosing. For practice, I'll have students respond to discussion board prompts and take practice quizzes. And the information I will provide to students will be in the form of lecture and demonstration. Now, looking at the 3 activities I have listed in these 2 columns, I can see that all 3 involve both feedback and learning. How do I decide whether to place each in the assessment column or the practice column? Well, the first thing I remember is that you can't really have students complete an assessment without learning something in the process. Even when completing a summative assessment, students are going to be learning simply by completing the assessment. So instead, I look to the primary purpose of the generated feedback. If the primary purpose is for summative assessment to evaluate what students have learned, then I place it in the assessment column. If the primary purpose is for formative assessment, for students to learn through feedback generated by the activity, then I place it in the practice column. In this case here, even though students are going to learn so much by completing their creative projects, I am primarily using this project as a means of assessing how well my students have met the learning goal, so it is listed in the assessment column. The discussion board prompts and practice quizzes, while giving me some indication of how well students are meeting the learning outcomes, are primarily used to give students opportunities to practice applying what they are learning. So for that reason, they are listed in the practice column. And like we saw with the last example, you can even place a single activity in both columns if you feel like it really supports both. The important thing is that students get sufficient practice before you evaluate them for summative assessment purposes, such as for determining grades. Okay, now it is your turn to give this course design alignment grid a try. Find a piece of paper and something to write with, and you can draw a quick and dirty grid like I show here. Start by drawing the lines you see in purple. One across the top and then one down the center, in a big T. Then add the 2 blue lines you see here to make your 4 columns. For the column headings, I like the simplicity of goal, assess, practice, and information. But you can call them whatever you like, so long as you know what they represent. From there, try to complete just 1 row for starters. Start by coming up with 1 learning goal for a course you currently teach or plan to teach. This can be a difficult first step, especially if your department or program hasn't already provided learning outcomes for your course. So for now, just get the general gist of the learning goal down. It doesn't have to be perfect. However, you will find that the more well-defined the goal is, the less vague it is, the easier the next steps will be to identify how to assess it and how to help students meet it. Give this some practice and then consider filling out a complete grid for the next course you teach. Happy course designing!